Welcome back. We talked about this yesterday. Vice President Kamala Harris calling on Donald Trump to release his medical records. Now, the former president is calling on the vice president to take a cognitive test amid calls from her to release Trump's campaign or have Trump's campaign release his medical records. Here is what the former president wrote on Truth Social. Quote, I believe it is very important that Kamala Harris pass a test on cognitive stamina and agility. Her actions have led many to believe that there could be something very wrong with her. Also, she is slow and lethargic in answering even the easiest questions. We just went through almost 4 years of that. We shouldn't have to do it again! Exclamation point. But a group of more than 230 doctors and healthcare providers are joining Team Harris in calling on Donald Trump to release updated medical records. In an open letter, the group writes, quote, Vice President Kamala Harris has released a credible, transparent update on her health and her medical history, and Donald Trump has not. The letter continues. On August 20th, Donald Trump said he would very gladly release his medical records in the 55 days since. He has yet to do so, with no recent disclosure of health information from Donald Trump. We're left to extrapolate from public appearances. And on that front, Trump is falling concerningly short of any standard of fitness for office and displaying alarming characteristics of declining acuity. Oh my gosh, all of a sudden they're worried about this stuff. Never were worried about it with Joe Biden, though. Now, in response, Trump went back on Truth Social to share a letter from his personal physician from last November that says, quote, I am pleased to report that President Trump's overall health is excellent. His physical exams were well within the normal range, and his cognitive exams were exceptional. All right, let's get to the bottom of all this and welcome back our good friend, Dr. Frank Contessessa. He's a doctor of internal medicine in South Florida. Dr. Frank, always great to see you.
Great to be with you, John.
Well, this used to be one of these things that happened every presidential campaign. Both candidates would release their medical records. What do you think about this controversy that's being stirred up about this? Number one, do you think we need to see more medical records from Donald Trump? And number two, should Kamala Harris take a cognitive agility test?
Well, I started to say a year or two ago when we started talking about President Biden's mental acuity, that I think anybody running for an office of this magnitude should have to take a cognitive exam, no matter what their age is. Because, obviously Donald Trump and President Biden are of an advanced age, but even people who are younger can show signs of dementia. So I don't think age has anything to do with it. I think it's a mental fitness issue. And I think anybody who's running for office should have to submit to a cognitive exam, which actually Donald Trump has done several times, I think most recently last year. So I would have no problem with him subjecting himself to that. And I don't think he would either. When you watch his appearances, the man can speak for hours and hours on end and then go do it again 2 hours later in another city. And he does it day in and day out. So I have less concerns about his mental acuity than I do about certainly President Biden. So I have no problem with any of that.
Yeah, I was waiting for President Trump to call for a drug test of Kamala Harris, too, like he did for Joe Biden as well. But we'll see where that goes. We do want to talk about another story with you, and that involves long COVID. There's been this new large-scale study from the American Heart Association that finds that COVID-19 is not just a respiratory illness. It also has long-term risks for your heart. The study found that the virus's impact on your heart can linger, which puts survivors at an elevated risk of life-threatening cardiac events for years, things like a heart attack, a stroke, or even death. Although the exact duration at this point is unknown. Talk to us about long COVID and the signs and symptoms folks need to look out for as it relates to heart disease.
Sure, John. This was an interesting study. It was American Heart Association, as you mentioned, and it was a large study, but all the data was taken from 2020. So what's interesting about it is there was really no effect of the vaccines. So the controversy of the vaccines isn't really involved in this study. It was all before that the vaccine was available. And what it showed was that people who had COVID were at least double the risk of having a heart attack or stroke in the future. But it also seemed to be related to the severity of the infection. So people who had been hospitalized for COVID, had serious COVID, had a 4-time increased risk for heart attack and stroke. And it seems that it's related to the inflammation that was caused by COVID infection when you had this cascade of inflammatory chemicals in the body that causes problems. And we know that inflammation causes increased risk for heart disease and stroke because it damages the lining of the blood vessels. What's interesting, though, is that now that COVID is a less severe disease, It'll be interesting to see if this data plays out because very few people, well, much fewer people are hospitalized for COVID now. It really has become to the level of a common cold. So it'll be interesting to see if this data continues as COVID becomes milder.
Yeah, we'll be watching for all that very closely. Great to see you, Dr. Frank Contessessa. We'll talk to you soon,
Great
sir.
to see you, John.